Need to finish the kind of historical background, hopefully relatively quickly, so that we can get into Bede. We've got today and Friday to do all of Bede, so that shouldn't be a problem. So we left off the other day, I believe, with Pope Gregory sitting Augustine. Augustine brings Christianity, and like I said, within about 100 years, most of the island is Christian. I alluded to Cadman. Cadman, that we'll talk about a little bit maybe today, but definitely Friday. A cowherd in a monastery, illiterate meaning unable to read and write, who has a miraculous, experience and can suddenly compose poetry. He can't write it. He's not given the gift of reading and writing, but he can compose it. And we'll talk about what that means when we talk about that, right? And everything that we talked about, today's Wednesday, Monday, all that historical information primarily came from Bede's ecclesiastical history, okay? Bede was a monk scholar, and he publishes his we use the word publish, but it's not like, he has a printer and it gets, the New York Times bestseller and all that kind of stuff. He publishes ecclesiastical history in 731, all right? It's ecclesiastical history means the church history of the English. The full title is the ecclesiastical history of the English-speaking people. Church history of the English, in other words, is what it is, okay? And it goes back to supposedly the founding of Britain. Anybody know where Britain, the nation, so to speak, the people, the Britons, where they originally came from? Troy is their founding myth. They derived from Brutus, who is the son or grandson of Aeneas, who is the son of Priam of Troy. So if you're an original Brit, you're really a Trojan. Okay? I don't know that I would choose that as my founding myth, because if you know the story of the Trojan War, the Trojans lost. The Greeks won. I mean, you'd want to be Greek. Okay? Anyways, Bede is what's called a polymath. He's great at everything he does. It's Bede. Bede is the one from whom we get our modern dating system. Not the very modern dating system, but the dating system that even the modern dating system is based upon. The BC AD, BC before Christ, AD Anno Domini in the year of the Lord. What has replaced that in the last 20, 30 years? BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. Interestingly, what's the dividing line between before the Common Era and the Common Era? It's still the birth of Christ. It's just, we're going to change the names, but the significant event is the same, okay? That comes from Bede. Bede's the one who came up with that. It's also why, historically, it's off by a few years, 46 years, okay? And he wrote a whole bunch of other stuff. He wrote biblical commentaries. He wrote books on music. He wrote books on philosophy, books on mathematics. Pretty much, if you had a question, he was your Encyclopedia Britannica at the time, right? And when he writes this, he's not just, making it up. Well, some stuff he kind of possibly does. But he tries to get evidence. He tries to get either eyewitness evidence or he tries to get letters as evidence. In one sense, he's kind of the first also modern historian in that he looks for proof of what he's recounting, okay? So we're going to skip a bunch. Bede dies. Bede is writing and same with Cadman, in the area of England called Northumbria. It's north of the Humber River. That's why it's called Northumbria. In a period that has kind of come to be called the Northumbrian Renaissance. Okay? Because this whole period, roughly 500 to 1100, the Old English period. Throughout Europe, anybody know what that's also called? The Dark Ages. Okay. Who labeled it the Dark Ages? Not the people living in it. They didn't walk around and go, oh man, life sucks because we live in the Dark Age. Those who were after called it the Dark Age. Specifically, the writers of the Renaissance, the period 1200 and up to about 1600, called it the Dark Age. Why? Because they lived in the Renaissance, the rebirth. Is that locked?
Yes.
Oh, it should be. Just leave it open. They lived in the rebirth of learning. You know, and what comes after the Renaissance? Anybody know the phrase of the period of intellectual history? The Enlightenment. Why? Because the people in the Renaissance weren't enlightened enough. Okay? And we think, I'm not take that back. I'm not going to say we. Some think that today we're even more enlightened than they were in the Enlightenment. So every modern period kind of looks back on the people that came before and says, what a bunch of dumb ignoramuses. It's what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. We always think our age is the best and brightest and most wonderful. Right? Not necessarily true. Yeah, I like modern antibiotics, and I like modern medicine. But there are some things that in the past were a lot better than they are today. Okay? So, Bede's writing in the Northumbrian Renaissance. In your book, if you were to look at the pictures on photographs, between pages 46 and, well, can't say that because there's other stuff. Well, the first two pictures on 40, the one facing 46, and then you flip that page, these two things. Okay? This, and maybe I'll put some of these pictures up on D2L. And this, okay, these are kind of from, this one definitely is from the Northumbrian Renaissance. This is an opening page of one of, I think it says, no it doesn't. I think this is John's Gospel. The opening page of John's Gospel in the Lindisfarne Gospels. Written about, created about 698. So, between these two dates. Okay? This is a belt buckle from Sutton Hoo. We don't have time to talk about Sutton Hoo, unfortunately. Solid gold. It's almost that size in reality. Okay? And the little, if you can look, see them, the little dark things in the interlay structure, it's not dirt or anything. Those are little tiny inlaid stones. Okay? This and this are products of the Dark Ages. We can't produce this today. We don't have artists. I mean, there might be some. But some of the things that were produced during the so-called Dark Ages can't be made today because the skill has been lost. It hasn't been passed on. So take that phrase Dark Ages kind of with a, grain of salt. Okay? Late 8th century, keep in mind, so this is 7th century. This is 8th century. This is 9th century, just kind of keep them in mind. In the late 8th century, we get the beginning of the Viking invasions, okay? In one of the manuscripts of what's called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, For the year 787, which is why I got another date down, because it's incorrect. The person who's writing it had the wrong year, historically we know. It was actually 793. Something saying, no, you've got that reversed. I don't think it is. There's a very cryptic reference. It just says, in this year, 3 longboats were seen. That's all it says for the entry for that year. Okay? There are some other things about, red skies and, stuff. So that's when the Vikings are first seen. And then they start making raids. The Vikings are coming from Norway and Denmark, northern Germany. Okay? And at first, they're just raiding the coastline. But after a few years, they start sailing up some of the rivers, like the Humber River and such. And then they start, camping over for the summer. Camping over for the winter, because the weather in Britain is nicer than the weather in Denmark and Norway over the winter. They eventually, start intermarrying and such. I mean, initially it's raping, pillaging, killing. What kind of places would they hit first, do you think? Let's say on a coastline. Churches, monasteries. Why? Don't have an example in here. I could pull pictures up. It was the custom. It still is the custom in some branches of Christianity. For example, to have a Bible, or more specifically, a book of the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that would sit on the altar. In that book would be encased, it would have a book cover made of solid gold that would be embedded with jewels. And a lot of people go, well, that's pretty stupid. I mean, why would you have a bookcase made out of solid gold? Because of what it contained. The Word of God. Okay, so you honor that what the content is by placing the most precious jewels and such on it. Okay? So the Vikings would hit that. What else would churches have? Chalices, right? Everybody in here has probably seen or heard of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. They go in the little cave, and there's all kinds of chalices and cups, and there's beautiful gold ones, because churches had those. Well, that's good for what? You melt them down, and you've got gold. They had silver and such. So the monasteries would be hit. Torched, people killed, cows slaughtered, whatever. Then they began hitting towns and such. Started with the churches and monasteries, then move on to towns. But after a while, as I said, they start to intermarry. Okay? Old Norse, the language spoken by the Vikings, sometimes called Old Icelandic, even though they weren't Icelanders yet. Iceland hadn't been settled by this point. Old Norse and Old English are brother-sister languages of West Germanic, okay? Or of Germanic, let's just say. They're close enough that an Old English speaker, an Anglo-Saxon speaker, could probably barter with a Viking, an Old Norse speaker, and be able to understand enough, okay? What wouldn't be crystal clear, it wouldn't be a 100% perfect translation. It'd kind of be like if you've ever used Google Translate. A little bit worse than Google Translate, maybe, right? So the Vikings start 787 or so in a raid for a period off and on of over 200 years. All right? They have some huge victories. They have some huge defeats. In 871, Alfred becomes king. I'm going to talk about this part of his name in a moment. Alfred becomes king, who never should have become king. Okay? Alfred of Wessex. He shouldn't have become king because he's the youngest of 5 brothers. In other words, eldest brother, king first, then second eldest, then third, then fourth, then Alfred. His eldest brother had been king. I don't remember how long. And I don't think any of the other three did. One of them died early. One of them was mentally unable, etc. Okay? So Alfred becomes king. The Vikings are really powerful at this point. If I were to put up a map, you've got the one in the back of your book. You have, if you think of a map of England, you could draw a line. So imagine the map is here. So the coastline comes down. You have East Anglia sticking out. Canterbury over here. Southern coast. Cornwall way over here. Comes back up. Bumps out a little again for Wales. Then you go back up to Scotland. If you draw a line from London, which is southeast, okay, and kind of go up this direction to about modern day Manchester or so, okay, everything north of that belonged to the Vikings, or at this point just called the Danes. Okay, that was called. It's been happening a lot lately. The Dane mark, something like that. I don't know why that happened. That was where the Danes held sway, where the Danes held power, meaning the Vikings. Okay? And the most powerful Viking at this point was a guy named Guthrum. Guthrum. Guthrum the Dane. All right? So Alfred's king of essentially a little area south of that called Wessex. Right? In 878, Alfred defeats Guthrum and his army. Alfred is woefully outnumbered. And he defeats Guthrum and his army. And there's a wonderful little story. And if you've ever, you can watch on, Netflix, The Last Kingdom, based on a series of novels by, not George, it's not Robert, so-and-so Cornwell. I can't remember his first name. I've read almost all the novels. I started watching the series and I didn't care for it too much. But it's set during this period, okay? Winter of 878, Alfred and his troops, they are on the run. They are being decimated, okay? And they run off, if you think of that, imaginary map I just had, they run off to the southwest section of England, and they winter in the marshes of Somerset. That is, they're on little islands surrounded by marshland, swampland, okay? Word reaches Alfred that Guthrum is planning a big battle, and Alfred sends word to all these little pockets of Anglo-Saxon warriors. And he gathers them all together, and they surprise Guthrum. And again, they're woefully outnumbered. It's like either 5 or 12 to 1. I can't remember the number. And they win. They defeat Guthrum, and Alfred makes Guthrum agree to a peace treaty called the Treaty of Wedmore. Wedmore. And it's kind of cool what Alfred does, because he doesn't just slaughter Guthrum. I should mention, by the way, Alfred is a thoroughgoing, 100% card-carrying, believing Christian. He wanted to be a priest, okay? But, kind of forced to be a king. So part of the peace treaty involves Guthrum has to become a Christian. And Alfred would be his godfather. Don't think, Mario, what's his name, Marlon Brando's, I've got a proposition. Not that kind of godfather. Godfather in the traditional Christian sense of a person who will help you develop spiritually, will help teach you what you need to know, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Alfred takes on that position for Guthrum. And by all accounts, from everything we can tell historically, this wasn't a kind of conversion that Charlemagne forced pagan Franks to accept, which was conversion at the sword. And if you don't convert, if you don't love Jesus, then you die. It wasn't that. Guthrum apparently bought it, hook, line, and sinker. Became a model Christian. Was baptized, had his people baptized, and never took up arms against the English again. Okay? Pretty big. Because that bought Alfred a period of peace. From roughly 878 until his death, 21 years later. During that period of peace, Alfred was able to, just like all of our presidents, doesn't matter which one. You pick, what are they want to take care of the foreign policy stuff. Why? Get it settled, more or less, so we can turn attention to domestic matters. Okay? What are some of the domestic matters Alfred wanted to do? He wanted to start schools. Okay? He wanted to revitalize the church because it was kind of going downhill. Priests didn't know what they were saying when they were saying the Latin Mass. I mean, they literally didn't understand it. It's thought that the phrase, I should put it over here so it shows up on the recording, hoc est corpus, is where we get the phrase hocus pocus. What do we use hocus pocus for? Shazam, magic act, where you pull a rabbit out of a hat. Well, hoc est corpus. This is, the my part is left out. This is my body, shed for you. They're the words of institution that a priest says when what's called the gifts or the host is raised, and they're calling the Holy Spirit on it to change bread and wine into body and blood. Hocus pocus. Because the priests didn't understand what they were saying. They could say the words, no cognition of what it was. Okay? So, Alfred dies, 899. His son becomes king. His son pushes, the Vikings back a little bit. His grandson becomes king after him. There's a famous battle called the Battle of Brunanburh, where his grandson, I think it's his grandson, Athelstan, defeats 5 kings. That's where Tolkien gets his Battle of 5 Armies in The Hobbit. Right? But the Vikings come and go. The area of Danish, power gets gradually pushed back and such. 991, there's another famous battle called the Battle of Malden. Okay? It's at a river, slightly northern England. It's Vikings and English. Okay? I'm not going to say much about it. The English lose because the English leader is stupid. His name is Brit, by the way. Okay? Well, why do I say he's stupid? Because his troops outnumber the Vikings. And his troops, there's a river like this, there's an island in the middle, and the only way you can get to the island is at low tide, it's a tidal river, is at low tide when an area of higher ground shows up. But the area is only wide enough for people to cross single file. And the English are here, and the Danes/Vikings are here, and according to a poem that tells us about this battle, okay, could be entirely fictitious, but most scholars say, no, it probably records some actual history of it. The Danes taunt the English. Yeah, well, if you let us fight you, etc., etc. And the English, because of their wounded pride, go, well, or the English leader does, says, okay, we'll give you safe passage. You can come across, one by one. Utterly asinine, because they could pick them off one by one. Every one. But they let them come across, and the English lose. Why is this battle, why is this poem so important? Because the end of the poem gives us the greatest expression of what's called kind of the pagan Germanic heroic ethos. This idea of you fight to the end. You fight no matter what. You fight when your numbers are dwindling. You fight if you're the last man alive. You never, and it's kind of what Winston Churchill channeled when he gave his great speech during the Battle of Britain. We will fight them from the hills. We will fight them from the rooftops. We'll fight them from the beaches. We will never surrender. Okay? I'll be the last man, fighting, so to speak. So the English lose. The ironic thing is, they didn't need to fight the battle. The English king at the time, Ethelred, had already paid tribute to the Vikings. He'd already bought them off for that year. But the old, grizzled English warrior, Brit was kind of like, no, we're going to fight them, And his men are like, okay, well, we'll die with them. They did. Ethelred, 1014, flees from a Viking invasion, okay, led by Canute's father, I don't have it written down here, Svein Forkbeard. So, big long beard and pull it in two. And Canute becomes king in 1016. By the way, when Ethelred leaves, he leaves. And his son leaves. His wife is left behind. His nickname, Unred, it's usually translated unready. Not what it means. The rad in his name, just like the rad in Alfred's name, means advised or counseled. So, Alfred means elf advised, elf counseled. Elf, they're probably implying supernaturally. Okay? Unread means what? Not advised, not counseled. Or in my terms, imbecilic, moronic. Okay? And I'm still going to come back to the Alfred the Great in a moment. So, Canute becomes king, reigns for a long time. Who's Canute? King of Norway. So, England and Norway are now united because it's the same king for both. Oh, I'm talking about Ethelred. Ethelred leaves his wife behind. She gets married to / has children with Canute. Okay? That leads to problems later on. Down here with Edward the Confessor and this. Okay? William the Conqueror, essentially, comes kind of from that union. So, Canute lives, dies, his son becomes king for a few years, he dies, and Ethelred's eldest son, Edward, becomes king in 1042. Okay? He reigns for 24 years. Now, between this and this, a very important event happens. In the mid-1050s, according to the best historians, Edward visited the continent. He went to Normandy, northwest coast of France. Normandy simply means land of the Normans. Norman comes from Northmen, Vikings. They're the descendants of the Vikings. Okay? Should have mentioned, the Vikings, while they didn't have a centralized bureaucracy and kingdom and stuff, they controlled really, in terms of their skirmishes and battles and stuff, they were from all the way from Western Ireland. The name of Dublin comes from Old Norse. The name of York in northern England comes from Old Norse. A lot of words we use every day come from Old Norse. For example, this stuff, skin, it's Old Norse. These things, it's Old Norse, okay? Any word you use that begins with sk comes from Old Norse. When you say I am going, the going part comes from Old Norse. When you use any of the third person plural pronouns, they, their, them, it's all Old Norse. Okay? We were, the were part is Old Norse. The original Old English was more like we was. So my grandmother, who had an 8th grade education, she spoke good Old English. Edward the Confessor. So Edward the Confessor, mid-1050s, visits William of Normandy, Duke of Normandy. And according to a tapestry called, probably going to spell it wrong, the Bio Tapestry, which is a piece of cloth about 18 inches high by 240 feet long. A single piece of cloth, okay, which records the Norman conquest. Right? According to this, when Harold visited William of Normandy, he made an agreement with him. If I should die childless, you will become King of England after me. Why? Because he had a tenuous claim through Ethelred's wife, Emma, who Ethelred left behind and had children with Canute. Right? And apparently when he made this agreement, according to the Bio Tapestry, think of this table, or this desk, as a big table with Edward sitting here, William sitting there, and they're kind of hammering out their agreement between themselves. And underneath the table, on the stretcher that kind of connects the legs, there's a Bible sitting that Edward didn't know about. In other words, this wasn't just a promise between two friends. It now became a sacred oath. Right? Edward dies January 1st, 1066, childless. That's, by the way, why he's called Edward the Confessor. He was married, but apparently he was so holy he didn't consummate his marriage. Well, that's one interpretation. The other interpretation is he didn't like girls, and that's why he didn't consummate his marriage. Okay? There's more evidence for the first one than there is for the second one. He dies, childless. There's no vice king. So, 3 days later, January 4th, a man named Harold Godwinson is elected king. He's elected by what's called the Witan, which is the council of advisors that the king had. The leader of the Witan was a man named Godwin, who was the most powerful landowner in England after the king. What was Harold's name? Harold Godwinson. Godwin's son. Okay? Why do you install your son as king and not yourself? Because you can manipulate your son and not have to take the slings and arrows yourself. Okay? Problem is, Harold had an older brother, Tosti. Tosti means heady, full of himself. Okay? And when Harold is made king by the Witan, Tosti leaves. He goes off to Norway. So, word is spread throughout Europe. Harold Godwinson is now king of England. And word reaches William of Normandy. And he's like, they broke their promise. And beginning around March of 1066, he starts building a navy. And he sets sail in September, okay, crosses the English Channel. 925, September 25th, 1066, there's a battle at what's called Stamford Bridge. If you're in English soccer, it is not the same Stamford Bridge that the football team Chelsea plays at. This is Stamford in northern England, okay? It's at a river. Well, at this battle, Tosti has landed with Harald, Harald, Hardrada. Hardrada means hard deeds, Put that in modern English, badass. You don't want to mess around with this Harold. They land on the northern coast and they move inland. Word reaches Harold, Harold, Godwinson in London. So he now has to march north to take on this invading army. Interesting little side bit. He has no standing army. They didn't have a standing army. According to the founding of the United States, we're not supposed to have a standing army. You only raise an army when you have a time of war. Okay? So he has to raise what's called the Fyrd, F-Y-R-D, on the way north. It's about 180 miles. Take that back. Yeah, it's about 180 miles. Okay? He has to raise the army. What time of year is this? Harvest time. People have got to get their crops in because they can't go to Walmart during the middle of winter. Okay? So he has to raise his army, go up, defeat this army, which he does. And it's when he's up here, word reaches him, a guy rides from London and says, "My liege, William of Normandy has landed on the southern coast," which is 250 miles away now, because it's 70 miles south of London. Okay. He's like, gosh, really? So now he has to march 250 miles to take on another army. The only problem is the army that he raised to fight Tosti and Harold, he can't keep them. They were enlisted to fight this battle. Now he has to raise another army to fight this other battle. Okay? So he starts to march south. And on October 14th of 1066, we have what's called the Battle of Hastings. It's misnamed because it didn't actually occur at the small town of Hastings. It occurred at a location that is now called Battle. The name of the town is Battle because that's where the Battle of Hastings occurred. Okay? It's about 5 miles away from Hastings if you ever have the opportunity to go. It's really, really cool. Okay? So he goes, and they have the Battle of Hastings. I used to, when I teach on a Tuesday, Thursday, I have a little bit more time, so I kind of put out on the board the whole layout of the terrain and everything, how they do the battle. The English were stupid. They had the upper hand through most of the day because they had the upper ground. For some reason, and see, I'm doing it anyways. For some reason, William kept his men and cavalry on the low ground. One of the things you learn in, military strategy is take the high ground whenever you can. It gives you the ability to look over, and it also makes the other side have to go uphill, which is hard when you're wearing armor or mail, etc. Okay? The French launched 3 assaults. The first assault, the English defeat them, and the French run away. Okay? They do it again. The French run away. The third time, the French assault with their infantry, and the English break what's called their shield line, their shield wall. Okay? What's a shield wall? You may have heard before on the news, something horrific happens, and leaders of countries say, "We stand shoulder to shoulder." 9/11. Tony Blair came out and said, "We stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States." That means right there. It's an old military metaphor. That means I've got my shield, you've got your shield, we both have our spears in our other hands. You can't break this. It actually goes way back to the Greek phalanx, where arms would be interlocked. Shields down, shields over, they couldn't break them. Okay? The English shield wall broke. Not because of the French assault, but because when the French ran away, the English thought, now we've got them on the run. It was all part of the military tactics designed by William the Conqueror. Because when the English broke their shield wall, unbeknownst to the English, the French had mounted cavalry off to the sides in these trees, groves, and the English began running, and the French conducted a pincher move. Hammer, anvil, and everything in between slaughtered. Okay? Edward dies. According to the bio tapestry, he's killed with an arrow into his eye. Probably because he did this. And okay? He dies. William the Conqueror, that's what he's called by the French, by the way. Anybody know what the English called him? Some still do, but not many. William the Bastard. Because he literally was a bastard. His parents weren't married. Okay? They wouldn't say that, to his face, obviously, because he wasn't a nice person. Edward dies. William commands that an abbey be built, a church be built, and the exact spot where Edward died would be where the high altar would be placed. It's kind of his way of saying, sorry, God, didn't mean to kill your anointed king, but I'm the anointed king. December 25th comes. Yes?
Which Edward are you talking about?
This is Edward not Edward. Harold. Godwinson. Harold Godwinson, sorry. Dies on 1014. Okay? December 25th, William has himself crowned King of England. Why does he do that on Christmas Day? Anybody know? There's a historical precedent. Back in the year, I'll put it here so it works, 800, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, has himself crowned by the Pope, Holy Roman Emperor, on Christmas Day in the year 800. What William is kind of doing is symbolically going, Charlemagne. It's almost like I'm Charlemagne reincarnated. Okay? But by also doing that on Christmas Day, he has the whole religious, symbolism of the day, and I'm God's anointed king, etc. That's really the end of the Old English period. Because one of the things that William does, well, let me put it this way. Over the next 20 years, because William dies about 20 years later, over the next 20 years, the entire English aristocracy, all the landowners, are wiped out. You want to talk about genocide? It's pretty close to genocide. They all get replaced with Normans. The English episcopacy, all the bishops, and many of the priests are killed. They're replaced with Norman bishops and priests. Okay? All the upper class gets replaced by Norman upper class. What language do the Normans speak? Norman French. This is the beginning of what's called the Middle English period. It's the transition from Old English to Middle English. What is one of the things that causes so much change in the English language? It's the bringing in of French. During the Middle English period, over 10,000 words are adopted into the English language from French. And that is why today we have both lawyers and, what's the other word? Attorney. Attorney comes from French. Lawyer, what's the there mean? It's just like the on act, or teach, or, okay? This is the native Old English. So you have lawyer and attorney. You might buy something. And one of the reasons you might buy that thing is because it has a really good blank that comes along with it that means if anything happens to it, you get it replaced. What's that thing called? warranty or guarantee. Okay? The difference there is one of those is Norman French and the other one is Parisian French. Warden, like a warden of a prison, or guardian, they're the same thing. Again, those are Norman and Parisian French, but those are both words that come into the English language. What's the thing that's out in the field that goes moo? Cow. What about when you put that cow on a plate? Then what does it become? You don't eat cow, unless you're weird, It's beef. Beef. That's Norman. Cow, that's English. What about, porky, pig? But you don't eat pig, right? What do you eat? Pork. That's Norman. Pig is English. Sheep? You don't eat, well, you do eat lamb, but you don't eat sheep, you eat mutton. Okay? And, a lot of the terms we use to describe cooking comes from Norman French. This is one of the reasons that makes English very, very difficult to learn as a foreign language, because of all the spelling variations. Those all come in from the French. The French ruined the English language, in other words. Okay? I teach the history of the English language. So that's the end of all that history. And we've got like 7 minutes to go. Okay. Any questions? Fire away if you have any. Okay. That's all in the introduction, by the way. It's in the lengthy introduction to the background, which I think I still have on the syllabus. Syllabus and introduction, the Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon periods, pages 1 to 14, so read those. Today, the section on Abbas Hill. Actually, we're not going to talk about Abbas Hill yet. I want to talk about pages 47 through 49, briefly. And that's the Christianization of Edwin, King of Northumbria. And I'm not going to talk, about a lot of this, but there's a couple of things I want to hit at. Edwin's having problems with Radwald, right? King in East Anglia. By the way, this picture, this thing, and the Sutton Hoo burial that's referred to, it's thought, we're not 100% sure, it's thought that the burial there, or the commemoration of someone who died there, was for Radwald, the guy that's mentioned in Bede. Okay? This was a tremendously valuable archaeological discovery when it was made in 1938. It's one of the greatest discoveries in England, period. Right? So whoever it was a very high status person. So, Edwin and Radwald. Edwin's having problems, with Radwald. And so a guy shows up at Edwin's place, and they talk, and he essentially says, what would you do if I could solve your problems with Radwald? He says, top of page 48, what if someone, he says, assured you that you will overcome your enemies, be a king who surpasses in power not only all your ancestors, but also all who have reigned before you over the English? That's kind of like saying, what if I could wave a magic wand and all your problems would be gone? Who wouldn't say, sign me up? And Edwin says, cool. So the guy says, skipping down towards the end of that paragraph, at this answer, when Edwin agreed that would be good, the man who was speaking to him laid his hand on his head and says, when this sign shall come to you, remember this conversation and don't hesitate to do what you have now promised. So when somebody comes and puts his hand on your head, remember we had this conversation and remember to do what you said you would do. Okay? So he's like, okay, great. So Paulinus another missionary comes to Northumbria at this point, and Edwin's, he's not sure about this guy. And we're told, right-hand column, second paragraph, 5 lines down, one day the man of God, that is Paulinus, came to him, to Edwin, laid his right hand on his head, and asked him if he recognized this sign. Paulinus wasn't the one who had this conversation with Edwin earlier. That was somebody else. And he says, remember this? Light bulb goes off. He says, yes. And Paulinus says, behold, with God's help, you've escaped the hands of the enemies you feared. Behold, you have obtained it by his gift, the kingdom you desired, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So, Paulinus says, before I say entirely yes, I've got to talk with my men. Okay? So he goes to his chief priests. They're pagan, by the way. They're entirely pagan at this point. And he goes to his chief priest, and his chief priest, named Coifi, says, here's the way I look at it. Okay? I'm the most righteous of all our people. He's not saying that arrogantly, by the way. He's saying, in terms of following our religious custom, I do it better than anybody else. None of your people has devoted himself more diligently to the worship of the gods than I have. And yet, a lot of these people out here receive greater favor and goods from you than I do. What's he just done? You don't recognize what you have in me. He's saying, if our religion was true, I should be receiving the greatest favor and goods from you, but I don't. If the gods had any power, they would have helped me more readily. This is the chief priest of their religion saying, our gods are powerless. It follows, therefore, that if on examination these new doctrines, which are now preached to us, are found to be better and more effective, we should follow those. What does he mean, better and more effective? That's saying it's done. They work. If these doctrines work, then we should do that. We'll stop there. We'll pick up there on whatever day it is, Friday.